So this is an exciting opportunity to learn about some of the leaders in our local communities and some of the disruption and innovation that they're creating whenever you look at public safety. We're really eager to hear about their approaches and what they're doing differently and their recommendations of how the business community and so many folks in the audience can join them in public safety. So we're just going to get to it and open it up. So Chief McMillan, I'd love to start with you. Obviously right now in the city of Salinas, a lot of the stats are making the headlines there. I would love to hear a little bit about you, because early on as a visionary when it comes to public safety and doing things differently, you very quickly would say things like, we can't arrest our way out of this. I recognize that this is it's a community problem. It's also going to be a community solution. Could you talk a little bit about what your approach has been in engaging the community in violence prevention?
Absolutely, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. It's an honor and a pleasure. This notion of how are we going to fix it, you know, I get cornered, you know, at your basic cocktail party, the guy that's got 2 glasses of wine in him and says, you know what, we'll just let them all shoot each other. That's usually followed by, really, is there a way out of it? And I say, yeah, to the drunk guy, trying to keep it at his level. It's simple. Give everybody a good job and good education. Because fully employed people that are really smart don't shoot each other. It's just not that simple. The challenge that we have currently, certainly in Salinas today, is that when we see the violence outbreaks like we have now, people come to law enforcement and say, what are you doing about it? Well, we're doing our best. But the challenge is, and the people like y'all who know, is not how to take the people who are shooting people off the street. That's certainly an issue and certainly something we're doing our best to deal with. The challenge is figuring out why it was okay for a young man to think it was okay to pick up a gun and shoot another young man in the first place. And you guys were talking about this today. This is an issue of hopelessness, of unemployment, of bad housing, of challenging parenting skills, social ills that are not a law enforcement problem that we all need to come together to fix. Our approach in Salinas has been, to the extent that we can, to partner with the community to build strong neighborhoods. And I think my colleague Jose Ariola from the Community Safety Division is probably going to expand a little bit more on this. But the idea that law enforcement is going to fix this problem is absurd. We have a role to play, but the obligation for public safety is all of ours. It's all of ours. In the private sector, in government, in faith, in education, it's all of our responsibility. And so emphasizing that and figuring out what the role that law enforcement plays is in that collaborative, in that broader collaborative, has been our key in Salinas.
So we'd like to transition and actually hear from Jose, who is the Community Safety Manager for the City of Salinas and also the Director for the Community Alliance for Safety and Peace, which is a cross-sector collaborative task force, commission, coalition, but an effective one. Could you talk to us a little bit about what that is and bringing the community together to be part of the solution?
Right, so to Kelly's point, Salinas figured out really quickly they needed a lot of the key stakeholders at the table to unite around the vision of a city at peace, a city without violence, and especially the significant violence problem Salinas has. I'm not from Salinas, and I knew of Salinas, and many of my friends did in San Jose because of its notoriety and its gang violence problem. And what we've created with the Community Alliance for Safety and Peace, and this was created before I got here, I'm lucky to join this movement and to help be a leader in it, is this amazing group of nonprofit, government agencies, community-based organizations, for-profit businesses, the faith community, that have been coming together regularly, twice a month, to learn together, to network, to work together, most importantly. And it's really a model that you don't see across the country too often. There's attempts at it, and it's usually disrupted by funding issues and people not getting along. But for whatever reason in Salinas, key leaders have chosen to set aside their differences to work on this issue. And to some great success, actually. In the last, over the last 10 years, we've seen a significant drop in violent crime in Salinas. Now, the headlines will tell you differently. Homicides are something different. When we talk about violent crimes, we're talking about thousands of instances within a year, not 30 or 29. So what we are seeing is the prevention work happening and the learning together around this isn't just a law enforcement problem. That's not that old of a concept, unfortunately, is starting to show some fruit. And there's still a lot more work to be done, but essentially we are a networking organization that works together, learns together, and when at all possible, partners together to really be able to grow our impact with what little resources we have. And for the first time in a really long time that I can remember, we're starting to see a bit of return of resources. For the longest time, the narrative is there's so little money to go around, there's so little resource to go to this issue, yet this group came together at a time when the Great Recession was coming off and decided to pool resources and partner to have a bigger impact.
Before we transition and hear from Sarah about her efforts here in Santa Cruz County, could you talk to us a little bit and introduce us to, quote, the peer model approach that's been adopted in the city of Salinas about that cross-sector collaboration? What does peer stand for? What is that?
So we were lucky enough to work as part of the national, be selected as one of the cities to become part of the National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention, started by President Obama, and that works out of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And they identified a best practice, so called the peer model, which is prevention, intervention, enforcement, and reentry. And it asks cities and states and counties to look, when they're doing this work, to look at it from those 4 approaches and to focus resources on those areas. So obviously with prevention, you're doing work that impacts just about everyone in your community, and you're doing it across different sectors. With our intervention, we're a little bit more targeted in looking at youth that are most at risk of being a victim or committing violence. And then we're also looking at enforcement. Enforcement, as Kelly said, they still have a very important role to play. And then there's reentry, and that's actually going to become, I think, one of the top issues in the next 5 to 6 years as we're seeing these large-scale release of prisoners that started with the AB 109 and now is happening all over the country. But we need to have a stronger system of ways to reintroduce folks from the prison system back into our communities, because it's a very difficult transition to make, and it can really go badly for us if we don't have the support systems in place for our community members that are coming back home.
Thank you. We're going to transition a little bit to Sarah and hear about her efforts with the Youth Violence Task Force here with Watsonville and Santa Cruz. Could you talk a little bit about what that task force is? And I did want to point out, we've heard from Jose and Chief McMillan in terms of a city as a catalyst. Sarah works with United Way, so a foundation, community-based organization, as a catalyst. Could you share with us about what's happening with your effort?
Great, thank you. So the Youth Violence Prevention Task Force was created a little over 3 years ago in a response to concerns about youth violence in Santa Cruz County. Traditionally, Santa Cruz has unfortunately had higher rates than we would like in terms of youth violence. And I do want to note that overall, as we're seeing, crime rates are dropping. But we really wanted to respond to the community's concern. Now, over the last couple decades, Santa Cruz County has worked hard to address issues of youth violence and promoting positive well-being for our community. There's been different collaboratives, community-based organizations, suppression efforts. But before the Youth Violence Prevention Task Force, never before has a county collectively come together to strategically look at the issue from a holistic perspective, looking at issues impacting youth in the schools and families as well as community, looking at programs, where are the gaps in our community, where are folks doing well, but then also really looking at systems and policies. Where are there barriers in our community? So we embarked on a data-driven strategic planning process for 1.5 years, and through that process, we engaged over 300 community members. We definitely engaged the traditional stakeholders, law enforcement, government, service providers. It was also really important for us to engage those with lived experience. So we knew that we had to hear from the families and the youth who are experiencing some of these issues and hear their voices. So we did, family and youth focus groups to really hear about what's going on in the community, where are the barriers for family and youth success. We went up to the juvenile halls and talked with youth, who are being charged with violent crimes. And through all of this community input, as well as mass amounts of research on best practices, practices. What works? What are the best practices out there for promoting well-being in our community? And we created a strategic plan just earlier this year. It's a 149-page document. Has over 75 strategies. I'm telling you, it's holistic. And so now we're embarking on implementation of that strategic plan. We have an initiative in Watsonville, it's being chaired by Chief of Police Manny Solano and the Mayor of Watsonville. And then we have a Santa Cruz initiative that is being chaired by Mayor Don Lane and Boards of Supervisors John Leopold and Ryan Coonerty. And we're really embarking with implementation of the strategic plan and expanding who we engage with as we move forward with this.
That's great. We're going to ask kind of a broad question now. Just from your experience being in law enforcement and criminal justice all these years, what have you seen as some key trends in terms of how the landscape's changing and the way folks are coming together and addressing public safety? Have you seen any difference?
First, I'd like to say I'm really disappointed to be on the panel that follows Gavin Newsom. I mean, how hard is that? There have been changes. It's important to understand that we each see these things differently based on the point of view and our point of perspective. I'm presently a Superior Court judge. I used to be a prosecutor. I was a prosecutor for 27 years. Anecdotally, a change that I have seen is a move away from a willingness to take personal responsibility and a greater blaming of authority figures or someone else for the problems. Let me give you an example, story that actually happened. I was in juvenile court as a young prosecutor, say 30 years ago, when we had parents come in to have their first contact with their child who had misbehaved in some way, which is why they were in juvenile court. The parents focused their emotions on their child, meaning they were upset, they wanted to know what the child had done, they wanted to partner, if you will, with the authority figures in dealing with the child. 20 years later, when the parents come in, the first thing they say is, "You violated my child's rights," which is a totally different approach to whatever has happened. And mind you, that's an uninformed approach. That's the first thing they say when they come in the door. I'm greatly disappointed by the change of attitude that communities as a whole seem to present to their law enforcement officers. When I was growing up, law enforcement officers were admired. They were, people aspired to be in those roles. They were friends, they were protectors. And so much recently, they're the enemy, unless of course you have to call 911. Then you want them to come and help you. And so there's tremendous problems in those roles when you're not seen as all working towards the same goal, or no longer being the protector, or things of that nature. And that to me is a very, very dramatic change in approach to these issues. Now, a different answer to that is I've been on these panels before. I've participated in many of these things, and it seems like the people who are here today represent a new attitude and a new change of the entire community needs to come together. And isn't law enforcement who's going to solve this problem? It's every single person in the community. And I will say to you, when you get to me, it's way too late. When you come to my courtroom, it is way too late. It starts in the family, it starts at home, it starts even before school, in my opinion. And I don't care how you define family, that doesn't matter to me. But young people need mentors, they need people who love them, they need good role models, they need things to do with their time so they're not engaged in gangs. And this is a new approach, I believe, to an age-old problem.
Lieutenant Governor Newsom talked a little bit about the future belongs to those who practice pluralism and holds that up. And he introduced that concept of not any longer power over, but power with, not a command and control approach, but rather dialogue and participation and sharing power with. Is there a panelist who could give an example of how maybe you're moving towards that more pluralistic approach of working with families, youth, particularly those who are kind of our knuckleheads of our community, right? Who are being difficult and maybe approaching it initially of like, you're violating my rights versus how can we partner? Could you give us some examples of when you've been in community with, participating, sharing that power?
I could start. Through the Community Safety Division within the City of Salinas, one of our strategies is a series of community leadership academies, which sounds pretty, I don't know, accepting a lot of communities might do. But the focus of this is really doing it over a long period of time and working on developing leadership in communities that may not feel they have the agency that the Lieutenant Governor was referencing earlier, and giving them access and putting them in contact with the current power structure and showing them how to participate and giving them the opportunities to participate. And we've seen a lot of success. We've been doing it now for 4 years. We have about a 60 alum. And you got to kind of be careful what you ask for, because they've become a very vocal group. And they're the group speaking up at city council meetings and demanding, and calling on me, say, Jose, you promised us this, or you said we could have this. We're asking for it now. And so it's really heartening to see. It really shows that democracy is a messy process, but part of that has really been able to engage. And we continue these. We're doing now 2 a year, and we've expanded to do middle school and high school as well. And it's a slow process, but as we grow and we have multiple generations of these leadership alumni, I think we have something special on our hands, and it'll show in the future leadership of Salinas.
Chief McMillan, can you talk a little bit too about how you've deployed some of your officers into the heart of communities where they're experiencing some of the most challenges in legitimacy policing, how that's building trust or sharing power with the community?
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard a lot about the need for more community policing. I don't think that's lost on anyone, that we need, and I love this one, cops got to get out of the car and play basketball with the kids. Okay, that's fine. We should. But there's a lot deeper way to do that work, and here's what we figured out. And we just had a national evaluation of this program in Hebron Heights area of Salinas done to show, and it's shown as a promising practice now, and that's on our website. You can look it up. When we deployed police officers, so here's the problem with police officers showing up in a neighborhood. Everybody says, okay, the cops are here now, we're going to fix it. And we think to fix things through a law enforcement lens. Well, how do we do that? We arrest people. The military call that a counter-terror strategy. The military would say capture or kill the enemy. Law enforcement would say find the bad guys and incarcerate them, remove them from society. That fixes your problem. It doesn't. And so a long time ago, we sat down with the folks at the Navy Postgraduate School, super smart people, and they said, you can try the counterinsurgency model and see if that works. And I listened to them, and I came back and told the mayor, hey, Mayor, we're bringing counterinsurgency to Salinas. And that went, he said, what? If you want to get people's attention, say you're going to bring counterinsurgency strategy to... Turns out you have to lay a foundation for it. But it works, and that's fundamentally what this is. So what we did in Hebron is we stood up a cross-functional team. Counterinsurgency strategy says, yes, you must capture or kill the enemy, right? You've got to find the serious bad guys, the ones that are doing harm in your community, and remove them from society. That has to happen, right? That's the civilian version of that. You've got to get the really dangerous people off the street. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. But there are other things that we have done historically in law enforcement that we thought were the right things and actually turn out to be doing community harm. Looking really hard for gang members and grabbing the wrong kid and saying, are you a gang? What are you doing out here at 11 o'clock at night? Baggy pants, red shirt, you a gangster? What kind of tattoos do you have? Are those gangster tattoos? If you go to jail, are you going to hook up in a gangster pod, or are you going on the main line? And it turns out the kid's just driving home from Hartnell College. Didn't do a thing wrong. But because we're looking for gangsters, we think that's what our job is, right? So now we've got a young man who was trying to improve himself and now was upset by law enforcement because we thought we were doing the right thing. And so we dialed back on that. Sarah talked about engaging the community, hear what the community wanted. We did the same thing. And in Hebron Heights, when we brought our cross-functional team together, which was education, faith, those groups that you would expect, probation, the neighborhood leaders, and 2 police officers that I assigned out there full-time. And they were told specifically, your job is not to lead. Your job is to listen and understand what this community wants, how they want to be policed, and you do that. Arrest when you have to, serve always, and see how that works out. And the relationships they developed were so powerful. They became instructors in what's called the Parent Project. Some of the most popular teachers in the Parent Project, which is a parenting curriculum. Some of the most popular instructors in that program in Salinas, they are so good at their job. These two cops are so good at their job. The other cops that have to work in that area when they're not around can't get anything done because they'll show up on a call and the people open the door and say, "Who are you?" "Well, you called the police." "Yeah, but I want our cops. I want Rich and Rawl, and you're not our cops. So I'll call Rich and Rawl later." Personal cell phones, those kind of relationships. It's a follower mode. It's a follower model. Law enforcement cannot be the lead agency in this stuff. We need to do a much better job of understanding what the community wants, what the non-law enforcement leadership in that community wants, and serving those needs. And I think our challenge now is really just bringing that to scale.
I think somewhere in the question, I heard a question about, can you tell us about a new approach or a new collaboration? There's one for Santa Cruz County. I don't know if they're Santa Cruz police officers or the chief of police here today, but this involves them. We're understanding, and we've known for a long time, there's a significant problem with mental illness and what you do in the criminal justice system with someone who's mentally ill, but they have committed a crime, and that's a different discussion. But it would be interesting, I think, for our general community to know that the Santa Cruz Police Department has on call and often goes out on call with a social worker, a psychologist, a mental health specialist. So when they've got a situation where outsider looking in at the facts, somebody is clearly mentally ill, completely off, police are called, and that's appropriate, but the police arrive with a mental health specialist who can help them deal with the issues that are presented by somebody who's mentally ill. And I have to say, when I first learned that, I thought that was wonderful. It is wonderful, and I was disappointed that so many people in our community don't know that. And I think that's a really important new and different step and a new way of collaboration that deals with these issues that can no longer be handled simply by police officers.
Sarah, could you give us some examples of how you see that cross-sector collaboration really coming to life in a meaningful way in your community?
Yeah, absolutely. So we knew that with Youth Violence Prevention Task Force, we had to move beyond the traditional stakeholders, that everyone in the community has a role to play in promoting well-being. Because even though, yes, we are called the Youth Violence Prevention Task Force, the entire strategic plan in our effort is strength-based. It's focusing on what we want in the community. And so even though folks in the community may have worked together in the past, for example, with our Criminal Justice Council, we're a task force of the Criminal Justice Council, you have service providers, law enforcement, judges, government, head of gang task force. So, we've all collaborated together in one way, shape, or form. But it's important for the Youth Violence Prevention Task Force is to work together differently, to work together towards something that we want to accomplish in our community. So we've engaged, we have faith leaders at the table. It's critical to have youth at the table. At all of our meetings, we make sure that we have valuable participation with youth. We have service providers, we have public health, we have government, we have justice. And everybody brings unique wisdom to the table and unique perspective. And even those that may have taken an adversarial approach to addressing some of these issues, miraculously so far have really found that common ground to work together on these community issues.
Let's see if this is on. Is this on? Testing? Well, I think I could speak loud enough anyway.
Oh, there it goes.
I've heard the, it's on now. I've heard the collaboration mentioned, partnerships mentioned. I heard the word education mentioned. I'm assuming and just making a big assumption here that education is an important part of public safety. So I'd like the panel to maybe ask or answer for me or for others here, what can be done to bring the educational sector into public safety?
I'll start.
Okay.
So my apologies for not mentioning education in my list of sectors that have been engaged in this process. In our youth section of the plan, over 60% of the strategies are either school-based or require a school partnership to maximize impact with the strategies and implementation. Education ranging from the boards of trustees of the school districts is critical to engage with because they're the policymakers and the top decision makers. And we've also engaged with the teachers who are in the trenches, working directly with the students and the families. We have to have all of those voices in regards to really moving these initiatives forward. And it's important for us to look beyond the traditional schools, to also really engage those in alternative ed, the charter schools, the non-traditional areas of education, because typically they face unique challenges, but also have unique opportunities for really moving the needle with some of these.
Jose, could you share a little bit more maybe about the multidisciplinary team approach and how the schools are involved with that, and maybe even a little bit of the PBIS?
Sure. So there's those two ways. So our cross-functional team, the community police officers that Kelly was mentioning, I'm just so proud of this program, so proud of our leadership for endorsing it. It's done in a way that's not done. When you hear community policing, it can mean a lot of different things. And here, they're backed up by this cross-functional team or multidisciplinary team that is essentially line staff from all the different agencies represented at the Community Alliance for Safety and Peace. Schools are the most important. They're actually the ones referring kids to the cross-functional team. So there, we focus on a specific area of a neighborhood, and we work with this team to identify kids within schools that are having issues. Because if they're going to present problems, they're going to present them two ways, right? Well, three probably. In the home, which we're not going to hear about too often. On the streets, which means they're really out of control because our officers will know about them. And then most likely, it's going to be in schools. We're going to see the first signs of potential risk factors like dropping grades, getting in fights, arguments with teachers, that sort of thing. And at this real time, when we meet monthly in this group, they're able to report out on youth that they're concerned about. And we begin to approach their family to offer wraparound services through this cross-functional team. In addition, we have real-time street info if they are active on the streets from our police officers and the relationships to engage. And I can't talk, say too much about this these two amazing officers who have built relationships to the point that when folks get arrested or know they're being looked for or have a warrant out, they call directly to turn themselves into these two gentlemen. These two gentlemen have done services above and beyond the call of duty, but they're supported so heavily by this group at the cross-functional team, and they understand the breadth of services out there and what can be done in ways to not get too many kids into the juvenile justice system, because that's really what we're trying to avoid at all costs. Identify early risk factors and intervene in a way so that they never have to go through the juvenile justice system.
So that interrupting of the cradle to prison pipeline, sometimes we hear about that, building a cradle to career success pipeline.
Yes. Now there's another side to that, right? Because schools have their own discipline systems. Schools can funnel kids right into that juvenile justice system aside from the streets. That's a real problem. There's been a lot of writing about that. It's the impetus for the Attorney General's legislation to not be able to suspend or expel kids based on letter K, which is willful disruption of school activity, which could mean anything. I've been a former principal, and I know it can mean anything. And that should be reserved for violent offenses or really out-of-bounds acts. Now, what we're doing in Monterey County is we've gone to where the schools are collaborating through a group called the School Climate Leadership Team. And they're looking at ways to implement PBIS in their schools, which is a way at looking at school discipline that, again, tries to engage kids and keep kids in school as much as possible and not suspend and expel. And what we know in California and nationwide is brown and black kids are suspended and expelled at a much higher rate for the exact same offenses than their white counterparts, and it's a problem. And these schools are looking at ways to address that, and it's not because we have bad educators or bad people in the classrooms. We have a stressed out education system. And so we have to work together to support our teachers who are doing a very difficult job and help them keep as many kids in their schools as possible. That will have a huge impact on our violence on the streets if we can really get that under control. And I'm so proud of the schools in Monterey County for coming around that leadership to do that.
And just to clarify, could you share with folks what PBI stands for, the alphabet soup?
Positive Behavioral Intervention Supports. It's really a framework of how to look at how you're doing school discipline in your schools. It's really asking you to look at who needs what sort of supports, in 4 different tiers. Of course, your top of your pyramid being your kids who really need the most interventions and supports, and finding a way to offer that within schools. I'm sure there's educators in the audience, like my colleague Liz over here, who could explain it much better, but it's a framework of how to do school discipline well within your school.
Great. Sarah, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so we're seeing some of the similar reform efforts in terms of education in Santa Cruz County. PBIS is being implemented throughout Santa Cruz County as well. In Pajaro Valley Unified School District, through some of the leadership there, really looking at data and policies in regards to school disciplinary policies. PVUSD managed to drop its suspension rates by, I believe it was 60%, and expulsion rates by 40%, just by critically looking at their data and shifting some policies, so using that data-driven approach. Alternative Education through the County Office of Education has committed to working with the Youth Violence Prevention Task Force to implement restorative justice in all of their alternative ed schools, which is huge. So there's best practices to interrupt that school to prison pipeline and to keep youth out of the juvenile justice system and keep them in schools and increase those graduation rates. It's just about expanding those and actually utilizing them and implementing them.
We're talking a lot about the cross-sector support and effectiveness. One of the communities we often hear about, how do you get the faith-based community activated? And now there's less resistance of how definitive that line needs to be between, quote, church and state. Could you share with us a little bit about how you've engaged the faith community? Who would like to do that? Chief?
The city of Salinas is fortunate enough to be part of the National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention. It's one of the administration violence reduction programs. As part of our membership there, we were able to collaborate with a number of other cities, among them the city of Boston, where we met this amazing guy called the Reverend Jeffrey Brown. Look him up, he did a TED Talk, it's pretty remarkable. And what he talked about in Boston was the violence among young men of color in the housing projects and the faith community under what they called the 10-point coalition. Got together and said, we got to do something. We don't know where to start, so let's just go see what's going on. And they started walking the neighborhoods. They just started walking these neighborhoods. They didn't talk to anybody. They were just present. And it took them months. The faith community in Boston walking through the project, it took them months before anyone would speak to them, and they didn't push. And what they found was, after they convinced people that they were going to be present, because so many of our communities, we invade with help and we leave. We do it all the time. And they didn't leave. They were there for months and months and months. And finally, these young men standing on the corner started approaching them saying, what are you doing out here? And they started engaging them, just talking to them. Tell us about your community. Tell us what's going on out here. And they started developing relationships, caring relationships with these young men who are in the middle of the fight. These are gangsters. And so they started to see the value there and made it a point to walk at night in Boston in the most hard-hit communities, just to be a strong, committed, peaceful, and faithful presence. And we took that idea. We brought Jeff Brown out to Salinas, and we started Salinas Night Walks. They went for a couple of years. They still occur through some of the hardest hit areas in Salinas, and is something that we call on fairly regularly when we see spikes in violence in certain neighborhoods. We can call our faith community, and they've taken it over. It's no longer a city project. We support it in a couple of very simple ways, but the faith community leads this thing. And literally with a phone call, we can mobilize 10, 15, 20 good people of faith to just be present in a community, and the calming effect that has is just remarkable. It's free, they're committed, the government doesn't have to run it. That's just one of the many successful examples we've seen in Salinas.
Sarah, are there ways that the faith community is involved in your initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. So the faith community has been huge in this effort. Their perspective is critical. So whether it's, Reverend Beverly Brook going up to the juvenile hall and working with the youth there, or going to the jail and working with the individuals who are in jail, or whether it's Reverend Tino, who is helping to support this Saturday's Peace and Unity March in Watsonville, or whether it's the FCC Church that provides a safe space for youth to come together. There's so many different roles that the faith community plays, regardless of religious beliefs of the faith leaders or those that they're serving. They provide a conduit and a sense of safety and calmness and compassion that many of these communities need.
So it's interesting as you're talking and you're giving these examples of how folks are working across sectors. There's kind of the latest flavor of the month, I think, in terms of change strategy, collective impact. Some folks have heard about that. How do you bring people together across the sectors, get them focused on a common agenda, results, and adopt evidence-based, data-informed practices to drive forward those results? Could you talk to us of how you've seen the necessity of like changing the business model? Like what's really keeping people at the table and changing the way that they interact so it's just not collaboration the same 10 years ago? Could you talk to us a little bit about how people are showing up different, the business model of collective impact or change in this way?
I'll go ahead and start. Data is really central to that. The Community Alliance for Safety and Peace got started a little before the collective impact sort of craze, and we were doing certain elements of it. And collective impact requires, I think, 5 key elements, and one of those is really being data-driven. And that was one of the key tenets CAS set up. Now, did we follow it well? At the beginning, not necessarily, but data has been really important because people want to know, are we coming together just because, or are our activities actually aligning and having an impact? And learning together, networking together, is that moving the needle at all? And data has been really, really important. Now, the city of Salinas doesn't necessarily have that sort of that skill set in its wheelhouse, that epidemiologist that could do that work, but our Monterey County Public Health Department does. So they were a natural partner to help us really look at both gather the data, analyze it, and be able to speak to it, I think, with some significance, because we would know it was statistically significant or not. And that's been really powerful. And I think in maintaining our network, being able to come back and say, look, we are moving the needle in certain ways, and in other areas we need to grow, but at least we know where we're at, and we can change and move based on the data and make informed decisions that way.
So in some ways, adopting some of the best practices of the business community of being data-driven, what's the return on an investment?
Yeah.
Is it working? Is it the right product? Is it the right service? And having the accountability and course correction along the way, perhaps? Yeah. What would you say as we're getting close to opening up to questions from the audience in terms of what were some of the key game changers in the way of bringing people together to do this different way of driving results forward? And I would welcome any panel member to speak to that.
Sure, I'll speak. So in terms of game changers, I think really looking at our social issues through a lens of equity. That's been huge, a huge shift in Santa Cruz, whether it's looking at how do we implement school discipline, whether it's how we arrest kids and incarcerate them, whether it's how we ensure that families have equal or equitable access to services. Additionally, it's for those that we work with on the initiatives, it's really finding what's their passion. Are they passionate about dignity? Are they passionate about public safety? Are they passionate about justice and equity? And honing in on those passions and those commitments and making sure that we're moving the needle and actually getting things done.
Would say we don't fund any of our partners directly. The Community Alliance in Safety and Peace doesn't have a funding arm where we give agencies money to do the work we're doing. I think that's actually been a real positive for this group and in staying together, because we do rely on their passions, as Sarah was saying. This group has come together around the passion of creating a safer Salinas, around their belief in peace and their belief of doing that work together, and have leveraged their resources through partnerships. That view, that sort of change, not being in it for the money, because a lot of these groups will come together around a big grant or a big donation of some sort or a new initiative, or and that lasts as long as the money does usually. But when you can bring a group around the principle of the matter, the true belief in that change, that I think is a key it's a game changer because it lends itself to sustainability. And that's what I've appreciated most about CASP, and I think that's what's going to allow us to be around and really, because we're going to be able to sustain for so long, I think really make a change in the violence in Salinas.
With that being said, some of the changes from the foundation community and the way that they're making investments, it seems that they're also exploring how they might redirect their resources in a way with greater accountability and return on investment to move the needle. As we close out, your challenge to the folks in the room, what is some way that you could see them specifically stepping up and owning their agency, as Lieutenant Governor Newsom talked about earlier today? What are the behaviors needed from the folks in this room? What do they need to be doing differently?
I don't know that people in this room necessarily need to do anything differently. It's maybe just a question of more. You know, we get it here. We get this is not a law enforcement problem. We get everybody has a role. And I think the challenge now is scale. The challenge is scale. When you know, you look at the analogy of one kindergarten teacher teaching 20 kids to read versus the scenario that we had the other night in Salinas, which was 75 police officers, including aircraft, mobile command centers, armored vehicles, to go after one murderer. You want one person affecting a lot of lives or a lot of people affecting one life? Because as we move up that scale, it gets harder to penetrate. It gets harder to be effective. And so understand what each of your roles are in this violence prevention scheme. Don't let mission fatigue set in. That seems to be the problem. It's easy to get fired up about this. It's hard to sustain it. It's hard work. It's hard work, and and sometimes it's really sad work but we're dealing oftentimes with very high-risk populations that are going to let us down now and again. So find your role, be active in it, and sustain it. That would be my message.
Sarah, and then Jose and Judge, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the back of our Youth Violence Prevention Strategic Plan Executive Summary, and it says we all have a role to play. Right? And it's about taking risks in these roles, not about maintaining the status quo. If you're an employer, take a risk and hire a youth or provide an internship or mentor somebody in your community. Or even if you're just in your neighborhood, get to know the kids that are walking by. An alternative ed teacher in Watsonville said, the biggest predictor, Sarah, of whether or not one of my students is going to be gang involved is the route they take to school. So get to know those in your neighborhood, build that community cohesion. Don't be afraid of each other. Let's break down those silos and individualistic perspectives. And if you want to find out about the other roles, you can visit our website at unitedwaysc.org.
Yes. And then Jose and
I
Judge.
have two quick things. One, if there's a collaborative in your specific area, city, region, like Sarah's, like CASP, reach out, get involved, ask how I can be supportive. We're probably going to be reaching out to you very soon if we haven't already or if you're not part of the collaborative. And the second thing is if you're an employer or a supervisor, my challenge to you is reflect on whether or not you're being supportive of the role of parent for your employees. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of what we're talking about here, one of the root causes is the lack of a solid adult in that person's life. And sometimes it's not because of bad choices the parent makes. It's because they have a huge demand on their times, and that crosses all socioeconomic backgrounds. And so I just really push you, as if you're a supervisor or employer, just reflect on it. Are you really being supportive of your employee's role as a parent in their life? Because that is going to have a direct impact on violence as well, violence prevention, because that means that child is going to have more from their parent in terms of time, and that means a lot more than money in many cases. So that'd be the challenge I put out.
Judge.
I think those are all great observations, and I don't think anybody needs to hear from me that each and every one of us needs to be involved.
Thank you. So we're gonna open up the floor for questions from the audience. Mallory?
Go ahead, Mallory.
I was very glad to hear you finally use the word parent in that discussion because I haven't heard that word throughout the day or throughout the discussion. And our jurist here on the panel said, if you get to my courtroom, it's too late. You also talked about it starts in the family. And I feel like sometimes there is someone missing from this conversation over and over and over again, and it's the parent. Either by not inviting them to the table or them not showing up to the table, there's someone missing at the table. And my question to you as a panel is, with regard to parents and parenting, are there any programs that have been successful in engaging parents to develop their parenting skills, both in their early family life and also when it seems like it's too late for those children?
Yes, there are successful programs. There's something in Watsonville called Papas or Papas, depending upon how one chooses to pronounce that, and it's dedicated to teaching men how to be fathers. It doesn't come naturally. We don't go to school for it. There aren't any books on it. And so that program is very instrumental in doing good work, and they just got a really great grant that's going to do, what's the name of the grant, Sarah? Okay, there it is. And it had something to do with the violence component. But I was struck when you said, why aren't the parents here? Who hasn't invited the parents? And when you think of what this gentleman said, good God, it's hard to be a parent. It isn't that they're making bad decisions. It's life is hard. There's so many things you have to do. There's so many drains. Maybe they don't have time to be here. Maybe they don't have time. They're so busy trying to make a living in a community that it's really hard to make a living in. So, I mean, those are terrible paradoxes. They're hard questions with no answers. But when I said, when you get to me, it's way too late and it does start in the home, I believe that. And it's a whole lot younger than I think people may understand. When you heard these panelists talk about school and truancy and reevaluating discipline and how important it is to keep kids in school, how many of you were thinking that means high school? Get this, it's grade school. There are studies that show the relationship, the single greatest statistical relationship that they've been able to correlate is truancy in elementary school correlating to adult criminal behavior, mostly in men. Wow, elementary school. So really, it is too late when you get to me. So we have to start with everybody. I don't know the answer to how to engage the parents, but you bet they need to be.
So there are lots of parent programs and parent engagement core to each of these initiatives. And I see Sarah eager to speak to that.
Great. I just want, so schools can be a major resource in regards to engaging families and parents. So I know that Pajaro Valley USD has been, for example, with parent events, they make sure they're done in English, Spanish, and Mixteco. So making sure the language barriers aren't interfering. They also provide childcare and food for families to encourage participation in classes, meetings, conferences, community events. In addition, when we were doing our strategic planning process, we had to go to the families. We had to go to them and at hours that mattered to them. So it wasn't just like an 8 to 5 because we knew that they were working. So those are just some of the ways of engaging families and supporting them.
And I want to encourage you, you can also go to some of the websites for each of the programs. For example, CAS has a website, and you'll able to see some of the highlights of strengthening families would be one of the evidence-based parent engagement, parent education practices, teaching parents good parenting skills, particularly whenever there's an adversarial relationship, some of those things.
And that's a nationwide program. And then the Parent Project that Kelly alluded to, that's for parents specifically who are dealing with kids who they feel are already out of control, they've lost control with. And that's been proven to be really successful in Salinas. And that's also a national program that's being used.
I might also say, in the state of California, if you wish to get a divorce and you have children, the law requires that each parent attend a 3-hour co-parenting class. You don't attend it together, because that's not positive. But the law actually requires that, so there's at least some understanding of how important that is. So there are some programs, not enough, of course, but some.
Kelly, you've got a difficult job. I totally admire what you do. You talk about the length of time that it takes to connect with the kids and the families, walk in the neighborhoods, really, your officers, the faith-based group, our Rotary Club, we work with the Interact kids, but they're already committed. Those are the easy ones. It's the ones that are hard to get to, and there's so many different programs out there. There seems like a fragmentation of efforts. Do you think there needs to be a consolidation? You take a look at the Boys and Girls Club, wonderful program. How do you get more consolidation so we're not working against each other and working in fragmented areas?
This, CASP, the Santa Cruz initiative, the overarching goal of all these collaboratives is to ensure everybody's rowing their boat in the same direction. These aren't well-funded initiatives. It's zero funded in Salinas at CASP. It's stone soup. I'm going to throw in what I can from the police department, and the United Way will throw in, and Partners for Peace that runs the Parent Project, forgive the alliteration, runs the, can add in to make something work. But overarching goal is to make sure that we're all coordinated. So there's a place for interact in that peer spectrum. There's a place for, unfortunately, a high-profile gang enforcement unit when we get to that far end. And are we all doing everything we can further upstream for the literacy and the 0 to 2 age groups? Find the coordinating agency, the coordinating body in your area, and this really, I think, is becoming the regional approach. Salinas issues are just different from Santa Cruz issues. They're issues. That's what makes them similar. They're similar best practices to deal with them, but they have to be dealt with local resources, local talent in a way that works best in the community. Find the coordinating agency, and that's how you beat that, Rodney.
As you can see, there's a lot of wisdom on the panel. We want to encourage you to follow up with them after today, become involved in the efforts. It's no surprise that Kelly was recently recognized as a champion for change by the White House. There's a lot of distinguished awards and panels here. The White House is looking closely about what's happening and feeding best practices. They're also learning. So something that came up even as lunch talk, how could we continue the collaboration across counties and connecting some of the bright spots and the solutions and sharing those, and not always having to go to Washington to seek out best practices, but to recognize all the good things happen here. So I want to appreciate everyone on the panel today. Thank you.